unveiling the mindset of Nefxanya Settler Colonial residuals of Abyssinian Empire in Oromia, the expansion of the European-dependent predatory colonial hegemony of the Abyssinian Nefxanya, structural oppression, and the epistemic violence of the most brutal outlaw village chieftains emerged in the region in 19th century. The warlords such as Tuadros around Gondar, who regned from 1855 to 1868, Yohannes of Aksum reigned from 1872 to 1889, Menelik of Ankober reigned from 1889 to 1913. They emerged out of centuries of turmoil, anarchism, butchery, and chaotic era that was known with the ornate name called Zemen Mesafint, means the era of princes, a plagiarized myth of a third hand, translated from Hebrew folklore, the Book of Kings version of Torah Bible myth, to 𝐔𝐬𝐧𝐯 language. They were armed by European colonizers of Africa, European arms dealers to the teeth, financiers, and mercenaries from all social groups, created a distinctive form of predatory settler colonialism that shaped the political geography of the Horn of Africa to this day. They enabled the outlaw cruelist village warlords local known as half-devils and half-ħabshas, Ras, 𝐷𝐸𝐻, Fitarari, etc., who acted as military entrepreneurs, administrators, and agents of cultural assimilation, invasion, conquest, occupation, and the establishment and maintenance of the status quo known as the Abyssinian Empire. One of the most barbaric predatory settler colonial empire in the Northeast Africa in the mid-19th to the early 20th century. Central to this process were settler colonialism, a structure premised on the displacement of indigenous peoples and the establishment of a new, permanent society on their lands, has been examined extensively in history, anthropology, and political science. Yet the psychological underpinnings that enable, sustain, and reproduce settler colonial projects have received comparatively less systematic attention. Drawing on social psychological theory, cognitive anthropology, trauma studies, and post-colonial scholarship, this paper offers a comprehensive synthesis of the psychological mechanisms that characterize settler colonialists as a distinct social group. We argue that settler colonialism is sustained by an interlocking suite of cognitive and affective processes. 1. Colonial identity formation, social identity, narrative, and mythic construction of the settler. 2. Moral disengagement and system justification that rationalize dispossession. 3. Cognitive dissonance and selective amnesia that maintain a coherent self-image despite evidence of injustice. 4. Collective trauma and intergenerational memory that reproduce frontier anxiety and the myth of a hostile other. By integrating these processes into a multi-level framework, individual, group, and structural, we illuminate how settler colonialism persists across centuries, from early North American frontiers to contemporary Israeli-Palestinian, Australian, Canada, etc., and Abyssinian of fake Ethiopian contexts. This paper interrogates the psychological underpinnings of Amhara settler colonial practices and warlord behavior, drawing on social identity theory, the psychology of domination and aggression, collective memory, and trauma studies. By analyzing archival sources, oral histories, and contemporary scholarly work, the study argues that 1. Amhara settler colonialism was sustained by a composite identity narrative that fused imperial destiny with ethnic superiority. 2. Warlords internalized and operationalized this narrative through personalized charisma, militarized honor codes, and a colonial mentality that justified dispossession. And 3. The psychological legacy of this period continues to shape interethnic relations in contemporary Ethiopia. Settler Colonialism as a Psychological Project, Wolf, 2016, argues that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event, sustained by elimination and replacement of indigenous peoples. Psychologically, this entails essentialist ethnocentrism, the belief that the settler group possesses innate cultural superiority. Future-oriented narrative, a mythic vision of a civilized national destiny that justifies present dispossession. We apply this to the Amhara case by analyzing imperial discourses, e.g., Menelik's 1896 declaration of civilizing the South, and the concomitant settlement policies, allocation of Galt land grants to Amhara veterans. The historiography of the Ethiopian Empire, commonly known as Abyssinia, has traditionally foregrounded political and military events while marginalizing the psychological dimensions of its expansionist projects. Recent scholarship in settler colonial studies, for instance, Wolf 2016, Veracini 2015, and Political Psychology, Staub 2013, Altemeyer 1996, offers new lenses for understanding how collective identities and individual agency intersect in imperial formations. The Amhara, historically the dominant linguistic cultural group of the imperial core, embarked on a series of campaigns that extended their political hegemony over the Oromo, Somali, Sidama, Afar, and other Cushitic, Nilotic, and Amic ethno-cultural groups, in one about 90 ethno-nations incarcerated within this prison house since her inception. These expansions were not merely military conquests. They entailed the establishment of settler colonies, land expropriation, imposition of the Amharic language and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and the creation of a bureaucratic apparatus staffed by loyal warlords. The present paper asks, what psychological mechanisms sustained Amhara settler colonial expansion, and how were they embodied in the warlords who acted as its principal agents? To answer, we integrate the psychology of structural settler colonial predatory Abyssinian Empire, as Frantz Fanon famously noted, is not merely a political process, but a profound psychological upheaval. It is a confrontation of decolonization between entrenched colonial structures, historical amnesia, and the aspirational forces of the Oromo struggle for self-determination. Framed by historical contradictions and structural violence, the Abyssinian Empire, often mythologized as a cradle of Ethiopian civilization, emerges as a paradigmatic case of settler colonialism as structure, a system of domination that transcends temporal conquest to shape enduring land, economic, and political frameworks. Drawing on Patrick Wolf's foundational assertion that settler colonialism is structural, not merely a series of discrete events, this paper examines the Euro-dependent settler colonial Abyssinian Empire's legacy as a system of predatory assimilation, cultural erasure, and racialized subjugation of the conquered indigenous population of the Northeast Africa. Central to this analysis is the paradox of decolonization. While it demands the dismantling of systemic oppression, contemporary decolonial movements in the Oromo diaspora and anti-Abyssinian resistance are frequently undermined by historical amnesia, misplaced allegiances, and the corrosive grip of authoritarian legacies. The Abyssinian Empire's colonial matrix was not an organic state, but a constructed hierarchy sustained by predatory elites who weaponized both violence and ideological subterfuge. To move toward genuine decolonization, decolonial actors must reject superficial reformation and confront the entrenched psychological and material mechanisms of the operating structural colonialism. The structural nature of settler colonialism of Abyssinian Empire. Patrick Wolf's theory of settler colonialism as a structure, not an event, reframes colonialism as a totality, a system of dominance wherein settlers seek to replace indigenous populations and repopulate territories to legitimize their rule. The Abyssinian Empire, under figures like Tewodros, Iohannis, Menelik, emerged in the 19th century, and followed by Haile Selassie to the contemporary war criminal global pariah Abiy Ahmed, an illegitimate gang's ruler, since exemplifies this structural logic. Far from being a natural extension of regional history, the empire was constructed as an extended arms of European colonialism during the scramble for Africa through invasion, conquest, genocides, ethnocides, ecocides, enslavement land grabs, occupations of territories of the Oromo people and the entire people of the South. An area more than 6 times larger and richer than 𝐒𝐫𝐴 proper, Tiger and Amhara mainly, to the �WHLO South, and the entrenchment of a racially stratified Amhara settler elites. This elites, often dubbed by people half devil and half 𝐂𝐲𝐲, for their moral ambiguity and predatory survivalism, perpetuated a colonial matrix through one land appropriation. The Abyssinian Empire systematized the theft of Oromo, the entire land off the people of the people, like Afar, Sidama, etc., about 90 ethno-nations incarcerated via military campaigns and garrison settlements, eradicating commonality tenures and replacing them with centralized, extractive governance. Land is life that holds profoundly truth to the great Oromo nation, and particularly for indigenous communities and rural populations who have an intrinsic connection with the earth. For them, land is not just a physical territory, but an integral part of their identity, culture, and existence. It is the source of their livelihood, providing food, water, shelter, and spiritual nourishment. The appropriation of land, therefore, is not just a matter of territorial acquisition, but an appropriation of life itself. When land is taken away, it is not just the physical space that is lost, but also the cultural heritage, traditional practices, and community bonds that are intricately tied to it. The displacement of people from their ancestral lands can lead to a loss of autonomy, dignity, and self-determination, causing irreparable harm to their well-being and way of life. As such, the appropriation of land is a violation of the fundamental right to life, and it is imperative that we recognize the sacred relationship between land and life, and work towards preserving the rights of communities to their ancestral territories, ensuring that their very existence is not threatened by the relentless pursuit of economic growth and development. Ultimately, respecting the intrinsic link between land and life is essential to building a more just and equitable world, where the rights of all people to their land, culture, and livelihood are respected and protected. 2. Cultural hegemony. The Amharization project enforced linguistic and religious hegemony, positioning the nominal Abyssinian Christianity as the sole tool of the mimicry of European colonial enterprise of 𝐔𝐞𝐽𝐥 war under the dress of civilizational mission, to appropriate lands of indigenous people, such as the indigenous Oromo Gada practices and Islamic communities in the south were marginalized as primitive or defective. 3. Economic exploitation. The empire's revenue was built on the commodification of labor, particularly through the exploitation of Oromo and the entire lowlands for agricultural surpluses, while Abyssinian elites hoarded resources for urban consumption. These mechanisms were not incidental but constitutive of the empire's survival. As Wolfe notes, settler colonialism produces the native it subjugates, rendering the colonized excess populations within their own lands. The Abyssinian Empire's structural violence thus created a bifurcated society, a settler elite, Abyssinians, and a dispossessed indigenous majority whose survival was contingent on submission or resistance. Some Oromo political elites, and the fatal erratum of historical amnesia, the historiography of the dependent and predatory settler colonial Abyssinian Empire, is crystal clear today than ever. From her invention, establishment, and maintenance of her viral modus operandi to the very date, she has been one of the most backward empires that found herself at the tail end of the 2024 Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, MPI, as reported. The facts have been the loyal servants the brutal, a ruthless rule of gangs for 28 sold years that is as clear as a diamond. One must swallow the bitter pill of truth and re-question himself if the gray matter is working. If we have the power to think, as an Oromo, and own uncontaminated healthy mind, that can ferret out truth from myth and fables and purify from all its debris. There have been no determinate time and factors than now in the history of the liberation struggles of the great Oromo nation. Contemporary some Oromo nationalism, despite its radical potential, often stumbled into the abyss of historical amnesia, at least for last 7 years than ever fatal erratum of Oromo politicians, aligning with forces that perpetuate colonial structures, mirrors Fanon's warning of post-colonial leaders who mimic their oppressors. The Oromo struggle, historically rooted in demands for autonomy from Abyssinian militarization, has been derailed by elites who deflect internal dissent as foreign interference. This narrative, akin to a colonial us versus them logic, distracts from the material realities of Oromo dispossession and reinforces cycles of conflict. The user's critique of Oromos as sheep following a shepherd underscores a critical psychological dynamic: the trust placed in unworthy elites who prioritize personal aggrandizement over collective liberation. This phenomenon is not new. Oromo leaders initially collaborated with Abyssinian factions, believing they could circumvent colonialism rather than dismantle it. Such collaborations, framed as strategic alliances, instead validated the colonial hierarchy they opposed. The result is a dance with gangs, a term evoking the tragic complicity of Oromo elites with Abyssinian and foreign powers. Sacrificing their communities, interests for temporary gains or symbolic representation. The psychological toll of this amnesia is profound. Fanon argued that decolonization requires a complete disordering of all the familiar landmarks of everyday life. Yet Oromo activists risk replicating the very hierarchies they reject by clinging to symbolic resistance, e.g., cultural reclamation, without addressing the structural underpinnings of their oppression. True decolonization demands not only the rejection of Abyssinian cultural hegemony, but the dismantling of neocolonial systems, including state surveillance, land privatization, and militarized repression. The corrosive legacy of Abyssinian warlords. Half devil and half 𝐂𝐽𝐵𝐻, the Abyssinian Empire's endurance was not a testament to its intrinsic legitimacy, but a consequence of its ability to co-opt and militarize predatory warlords. The legacy perpetuated a cycle of self-aggrandizement and erasure like their ascent, marked a decisive departure from local outcasted chieftains figures like 𝐂𝐧𝐯 Tuadros, a son of a Koso vendor, Menelik, Haile Selassie, Tafari Makonnen to the current tenure Abiy Ahmed. These figures embodying the duality of the half-devil and half-𝐂𝐽𝐵𝐻. Their survival hinged on strategic violence, genoids, exterminating rivals, delusional war criminal and global pariah consolidated power by subjugating the entire southern populations since her invention and sanctify territorial expansion. Indeed, there is nothing in this brutal historical continuum to extol. Its hallmark has consistently been one of relentless self-aggrandizement and a pernicious brutality. The psychological trauma of this erasure is intergenerational. Oromos, long denied political agency, internalized the Abyssinian narrative of their own inferiority. Even after the 1974, 1991-2018 revolution, Abyssinian elites retained control by co-opting Oromo cadres into their bureaucratic apparatus, ensuring structural continuity of the predatory settler colonial Abyssinian empire to the very date. The term half-devil and half-𝐂𝐽𝐵𝐻 thus captures the Abyssinian psyche, a moral corruption rooted in the imperative to dominate. Unlike European colonizers, Abyssinian settlers were not outsiders but ethnically distinct groups, Amhara, Tigray, who weaponized their cultural identity to subjugate others. This internal colonialism, as Aimé Césaire described, was subtler but no less destructive. It required the cultivation of a parasitic elite who saw themselves as guardians of a civilized culture against the barbarism of the South. These historical figures, in their deluded self-importance, sought to redefine their very essence and uniqueness, leading not to prosperity or unity, but to a perpetual cycle of relentless wars, widespread hunger, state-sponsored terror, mass displacement, and desperate flight, etching a legacy of immense suffering rather than any discernible benefit to the populace they claimed to rule. Toward a decolonial psychobiology, the Abyssinian Empire's structural violence and the complicity of some miseducated degree holders and political leaders in its perpetuation reveal a critical truth. Decolonization is not merely repulsing one dictator with another, even worst dictators such as Abiy, but a battle for the narrative of the self such as Oromoness, a radical change. As stated by Angela Davis, means grasping issues at the root not superficial that requires structural transformation to dismantle the oppressive Abyssinian settler colonial systems. To move beyond cycles of confusions and misplaced loyalty, decolonial movements must confront the psychological entanglements of colonialism, internalized inferiority, historical amnesia, and the seductive allure of power. The Oromo struggle, once a beacon of anti-colonial resistance, must reject the siren call of dancing with gangs one after the other, and instead build a politics that dismantles the substantified structures of Abyssinian domination. Only then can the last become first, not through symbolic repudiation, but through the material and ideological reconstruction of a world no longer haunted by the half-devil and half-𝐒𝐫𝐴. The major cancer of Oromoness/Oromama has been of the 𝐒𝐫𝐵𝐴nized equated with civilized nominal Oromos with null wisdom of Oromama since the inception of the empire. Among them, such as Gobana, the working horse of Menelik to the contemporary war criminal, blasted liar of global reckoning, a cold-blooded killer and personal dictator Abiy Ahmed, a leader of the conglomerates of retro-fascists collections under the mantra of Prosperity Party. These cohesive circles have been the bitter enemy of the liberation struggle. These puppets reached a metastasis stage, an irreversible stage, and they cannot recycled to Oromoness or Oromia. The entrenched conglomerates of settler colonial gangs, psychic from within and diaspora, that upsurge and shapes the regime's apparatus on a daily basis, found in the final phase of apoptosis. In human history, there are only two things in life. Either one is free while liberated, or slave while colonized physically and mentality. Tracing the formation of the contemporary Ethiopian empire under Saul Merim or Menelik through the successive regimes of Haile Selassie, the Derg, the EPRDF, and the current Prosperity Party, this study posits that the central apparatus of the state has consistently operated outside the domain of consensual democratic governance. Consequently, for the Oromo nation, the largest demographic and historically dispossessed group in the region, traditional Western frameworks of democratization and institutional reform have historically functioned as instruments of co-optation and pacification rather than liberation. Applying the Clausewitzian concept of ultima ratio regis, the final argument of kings, to the liberation struggle, this paper contends that the Oromo Liberation Army, OLAWBO, represents the necessary ultima ratio for national self-determination and emancipation. Now the hour is ticking either to liberate Oromia or turn back to the slave of Nefxanya, safaris on our own ancestral soli. There are no ifs, ands, or buts left. Even Vatican City has a defense system, the Swiss Guard, let alone Great Oromia.